All right, man. All right, merci, Ali. That's it.
C'est un go?
Oui, je suis live.
C'est bon, go.
Ciao. Bye. Ciao.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in the room and remotely. My name is Anne-Marie Schreier, and I'll be the moderator for this press briefing. Today we'll discuss some priorities for this week's negotiations. Please note that the briefing is on the record. It's also being recorded, and the recording will be made available after the briefing. Before we get started, I just want to briefly introduce today's speakers in speaking order. So Mr. Brian O'Donnell, Director, Campaign for Nature, he's speaking first. Dr. Stephen Woodley, Vice Chair for Science and Biodiversity, World Commission on Protected Areas from the International Union for Conservation of Nature, will speak second. Jennifer Corpus, who is lead for targets 1 to 8 for the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, and also Senior Global Policy and Advocacy Lead for Neotero, will speak after. And we will have Mr. Stanislas Stefan Muba, Director General for Environment and Nature Protection and Head of Delegation for CBD negotiations for the Gabon. We'll have time for questions following the speaker's remarks. When asking questions, we ask that you please introduce yourselves, providing your name and media outlet. We'll take questions from the room, as well as for participants joining us virtually today. And with that, I will hand it over to Brian. Please go ahead.
Good morning, and thanks everyone, and good afternoon for those of you who are joining remotely or via video. I'm going to speak briefly about one of the most important unresolved issues that is being discussed for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, an issue that's critical to success, and that is finance. We all know that policy ambition is important for safeguarding biodiversity and addressing the biodiversity crisis, but equally important is the finance to achieve those policy ambitions. We're going to hear from Jane and Stephen and Stephen Woodley, all talking about the details of that policy. So I'm going to let them get into the details of that, about the importance of area-based conservation, the rights of Indigenous peoples, and other important components of the post-2020 framework. But we know that we can't see any of these bold policy initiatives succeed without ambitious finance. Targets and goals in the framework are really the intentions and aspirations of the post-2020 framework. It's the financial commitments that turn those aspirations into results. And that's why we feel that the finance component of the framework is one that needs more attention, more political priority, and ideally some major progress here in Nairobi. I think if you asked any of the delegates who are here at the negotiations or any of the NGOs or other observing organizations or entities, they would tell you that the main reason that the last biodiversity framework, the IT targets, failed to succeed in reversing the loss of biodiversity was because we did not see an adequate commitment of financial resources. That's a mistake that can't be repeated here in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Remember that scientists have told us that biodiversity is declining at rates unprecedented in human history. And this biodiversity loss will have grave consequences for all life on Earth. This is no time for half measures. This is the time for bold ambition for governments around the world. Transformational change is what's recommended by scientists. And that transformational change not only needs to happen in the way we think about our policy of implementing biodiversity conservation, but also in how we finance biodiversity conservation. How do we do that? Well, we think a global commitment of at least 1% of GDP is needed annually to address the biodiversity crisis. That's the level of crisis finance that we need to materialize, and parties need to commit to that level by 2030. Next, we feel that wealthy countries need to increase the support for developing countries in terms of investing at least $60 billion annually for biodiversity conservation in the developing world. Know that much of the world's loss of biodiversity is caused by the high consumption patterns of wealthy nations, and a lot of it is driven through international trade. So there's a responsibility globally that wealthy nations have to help fund biodiversity conservation. And we believe that $60 billion is the minimum amount of figure annually. Many have argued for a higher level. This level should come in the form of grants. We cannot burden the developing world with more debt as it safeguards biodiversity. We think that grants are an appropriate approach for the transfer of resources from wealthy nations to developing countries for biodiversity. And we also believe that Indigenous peoples and local communities should have direct access to these funds. They're at the front lines of biodiversity conservation and defending biodiversity around the world, and they should have the ability to access the resources from wealthy nations without the current level of delay and bureaucracy that has burdened it, and too much of that money has never reached the ground. So this has to change if we're to be successful in implementing a global biodiversity framework. Finally, it's important to recognize that money invested in nature is exactly that. It's an investment. Economics studies have shown that about a 5-to-1 return comes when we protect nature, and we avoid the massive future costs that come from the degradation of nature. Costs such as natural disasters and floods or storm damages, as well as zoonotic diseases that we've all seen recently, and future pandemics that can be caused due to the loss of nature. So we have to look at spending for nature as an investment, not a cost. There's major opportunities to eliminate subsidies, and that can help close the biodiversity finance gap. Removing those subsidies that are harmful to nature, subsidies that cause us to do overfishing or extractive uses, fossil fuels that are driving extinctions, we need to make sure that those subsidies are reformed. And there's also room for the private sector to help fund increasingly the safeguarding of biodiversity. However, we know that the majority of the financing needs to come from governments, and the private sector won't act alone. The private sector needs to make sure that there are incentives or regulations that require them to take biodiversity into account into their business practices. So governments play that leading role. Just to close, I would say that finance is the most important issue that is unresolved yet in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And without resolving that issue, we cannot reach the bold, important targets, the safeguards for Indigenous peoples, the area-based conservation, and other measures that you'll hear about from other speakers going forward. And I'll be happy to take questions at the end of the full panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. We had a bit of a lag for the sound with some of our virtual participants, so that was Brian O'Donnell, Director of Campaign for Nature. Our next speaker will be Dr. Stephen Woodley, Vice Chair for Science and Biodiversity, World Commission on Protected Areas, and the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And just Stephen, before I hand over to you, just a note for virtual participants, please put your questions in the chat or Q&A with your name and media outlet, and we will address them after the panel. Thank you.
So good morning, everyone. We're here talking about area-based conservation and how much and what type of area-based conservation we need. First, just a few lines on the scope of the problem. We use words like the Anthropocene or existential crisis, and those are code words for the fact we're in deep trouble. And our kids are in deep trouble, and we have to keep this in mind as we're thinking about it. 85% of the oceans have been significantly altered. 75% of land has been significantly altered. There's 1 million species at risk. And something that drives it home for me is if you look at all the wild mammals, just wild mammals on the earth, of all the mammals on the earth, only 4% of them are wild mammals. So that's how much we've come to dominate the situation. So why do we need area-based conservation? Because the drivers of that kind of biodiversity loss are habitat loss and fragmentation. Those are the key drivers. Over-harvest more in the ocean. But they can be mitigated by good area-based conservation. So how much area-based conservation do we need? I did a global review of all the literature on this subject, and the results are astonishingly clear and compelling. There's really good agreement on the results, and there's hundreds of relevant studies. First of all, the old ACHI targets are not nearly enough to protect nature. Sometimes we get hung up in the number. We have this 30% number floating around in the atmosphere here, and the quality of those areas is just as important as the number. That's really clear. If we could take 30% of the planet and do little for biodiversity conservation, or we could take 30% of the planet in the right places and do astonishingly good things for nature. The exact amount really depends upon the values that you consider. So if you're just thinking about species at risk, or if you're thinking about geographically restricted ecosystems, you get a number like 30%. 30% is, in the right place, is always the minimum number. There are no studies under 30%, either regionally or globally, that look at this. If you take in all the biodiversity values, including ecosystem services and carbon values and representativity and connectivity, you can get to very high numbers of lands that need to be managed if we're going to protect nature, up to 70%. So the ideas of nature needs half or half Earth, they're actually not crazy at all. They're really well supported in the science. I guess the other thing is that if we're going to protect this much land, how are we going to affect people? And this has been brought up time and time again as we've had this discussion. Much of the intact ecosystems left on, certainly on land, are run by Indigenous and local peoples. They're traditional owners of these lands. And I think any solution needs to support that ownership and traditional use. We're not talking, at least from my perspective, and the science is pretty clear on this, we're not talking about a land grab or a land alienation, because the way those lands are managed now are doing a great job at protecting nature. We have to look at differentiating different responses according to different conditions on the earth if we're going to be successful in doing that. Not all countries can protect 30%. Some countries are going to protect more, but it's really clear we need effective and high numbers, high percentage values of area-based conservation if we're going to be successful in protecting nature. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Woodley. I'd like now to hand over to Jennifer Corpus. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And I take the floor here on the podium in the shadow of what is happening to our Maasai brothers and sisters in Loliondo. We really wanted Maasai to join this press conference to talk about the situation in their community. But because of the highly volatile situation and the jeopardy that they are in, we weren't able to get someone from the Maasai community. But we did hear from them. We had a preparatory meeting for the very first Africa Protected Areas Congress on June 15. And the testimonies are heartbreaking. So what is happening there? 1,500 square kilometers is being taken over for a hunting reserve. And 700 children, women, and men from the Maasai community have had to transfer, have been evicted essentially. They have crossed the border to Kenya and are now seeking refuge and treatment for their wounds there. They have asked us specifically to talk on their behalf because of the security situation. So we are here and we want to raise that issue. You've heard it in the opening statement of the IIFP. But what I wanted to say now is that it's outrageous and unbelievable that things like this still happen, despite equity being a part of the current target 11 on area-based conservation targets. What does this tell us? It tells us that we need to do more, we need to do better. Maybe the word equity hiding in there in one of the elements of target 11, it's not enough. There has to be stronger recognition of rights in the current target 3 that is being negotiated. If we look at the scientific studies, the IPBES assessment, the GBO, the local biodiversity outlooks, all of them identify full partnership with Indigenous peoples as an opportunity to advance on enhancing the quality of protected areas and on expanding the areas that are nurtured and protected by communities and Indigenous peoples. Therefore, it would be a major missed opportunity not to embed rights fully in the targets that we are talking about, because the rights there is a pathway towards ensuring full partnership with Indigenous peoples. I could talk very specifically about the language, but maybe this is not the right place to do it. But I wanted also to re-echo what Stephen has said around quality. We're chasing the numbers, but it's also important to make sure that we have good quality protected areas, conservation areas, and even indigenous territories, traditional territories being protected under Target 3. We also talked about finance, and for indigenous peoples, it's very important to have dedicated funds and direct access to the finance that's necessary to enhance the quality of protected areas. And in our experience, in the experience of our communities, the best way to make sure that the money goes to conservation and sustainable use is to invest in indigenous peoples. We have experiences, examples like Indigenous Guardians programs, where indigenous peoples themselves go to the furthest reaches of their territory in order to make sure that biodiversity is protected. So this is my key message. Let us not let the situation in Tanzania continue. Let us adopt conditions here and language here that would make sure that indigenous peoples will be full partners in ensuring that biodiversity loss is halted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for raising these important issues. Brian, you wanted to weigh in?
I just wanted to, Campaign for Nature would just like to fully endorse everything that Jennifer said, and we stand in solidarity with IFB on this issue and think that this is critical that it be resolved this week, and that the rights language, strong rights language, be embedded within Target 3.
Great, thank you very much both. Mr. Huba, you have the floor. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for giving the floor, and I'm happy to intervene after such a very strong message from the colleagues here. I think from a government perspective, we heard what science said about the fact that biodiversity is in a very important crisis at the time. We also heard what the IPLCs can face in that situation where the biodiversity is in crisis and where we need more sustainable management. And when we are negotiating here as government, we are not negotiating as Gabon or as Africa. We are dealing with a global issue. And some of the time when we talk about finance issues, we feel like people are thinking that we are begging money for our countries. We are, as Gabon, we are 88% forest cover. We have 20 marine protected areas. We have 13 national parks. We have 9 Ramsar sites. And at this point of the fight at a global level, we think we are doing our contribution. Gabon is absorbing each year 100 million of CO2. So when we are talking about finance here, we are not talking about financing Gabon. We are talking about maintaining world heritage, maintaining, conserving that biodiversity that serve the global community. And this finance discussion is not about what we need, what we deserve. It's what we should, as global community, invest to make sure our world is sustainable. And what Gabon is doing, it's, if we consider that at the time Africa is 1.2 billion people, and by 2050 will be the double, will be 2.5 billion people on this earth, and we don't invest in making Africa going into sustainable development pathway, we will do worst impact on biodiversity, on climate, on all of those issues, desertification, plastics, that's what already happened. So at this stage, we need to all think about what is the world we want to give to the next generation. And we still have the opportunity to save that world. We still have the Congo Basin forest standing here and giving ecosystem services to the whole world. If we think about a world where there is no more Congo Basin, you can't imagine how many population rely on it within the Congo Basin, but also with the science now, we know that Congo Basin is also driving the rainfall pattern in Eastern Africa, in Egypt, in the north of Ethiopia. And if we don't have water in the night, we don't have agriculture in Egypt. And we have hundreds of millions of Africans going to Europe. And we already know at this stage what are the disasters that those migration can have in terms of culture, in terms of security, in terms of peace. And at this critical time for the world, I think we should all think about what we want to leave to the next generation. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Muga, for these remarks and sharing the experience of Gabon and the importance for Africa. So this brings us to the end of our official remarks. We will open the floor up for questions. We'll start with questions in the room. Somebody will go around with a mic, and then we will take some questions that were shared by virtual participants as well.
Hello, I'm Diwakar Kakurid from Nepal. I'm quite concerned about financing. That's why my question is for the first speaker majorly. So your tips your suggestions and demands from the developed countries were quite clear that they should invest at least $60 billion in biodiversity conservation. So what are your suggestions and tips for the developing countries? So how can they utilize the resources that they utilize the resources they have in the best way, and so how can they attract more resources? Thank you.
And Stephen, I think could address this as well. Do you want to start on that first?
You can go on that, I will come.
Okay, I think one of the most important things is that every country, after the Global Biodiversity Framework is agreed to, will develop what's called the National Biodiversity Strategy Plan and Action Plan. Those plans also need to have finance plans associated with them, so that there is a clear view not just of what's going to happen in terms of the policy changes that will happen in each country, but what kind of financial changes will happen. I think that inspires confidence both domestically and internationally, that there's a well thought out plan, that these resources are going to be used effectively, and that they're part of a component, and that it's going to really lead to biodiversity outcomes. So I think the most important thing, the first step, is to develop those national biodiversity plans and the accompanying national biodiversity finance plans that do show that every country, I mean, Gabon has been a great example of this. While international donors are supporting forest conservation and marine conservation in Gabon, Gabon is also putting a substantial amount of domestic resources into it. And I think that provides confidence from philanthropies, from wealthy nations, that Gabon is really walking the walk. They're showing leadership on this, and that makes it a very attractive place to increase financing.
Yeah, thank you. I want to add on this that we already see a lot of solutions already implementing in developing countries. When you talk about 30 by 30 now, the champions in this are coming from developing countries. Colombia will reach this year the 30 by 30 goal. Gabon, we hope that before 2030 will reach the 30 by 30 goal. We already have 21% of land protected. But this means that those countries are investing themselves in the conservation policies. And another hand, we also need to talk about the private sector money. If I can take the example of Gabon, we have been exporting wood for almost a century in Gabon, and it was just the raw materials that we were exporting, not transformed wood. And what we see, it's like when we spend those century exporting that wood, it was 90% for the country that get the wood and transform it in the country, and 10% of the value retaining in Gabon. So also to conserve and to maintain those policies, we need also to develop our industries in our country, sustainable industry, and also to make sure that the population in those countries know and feel that there is a value to conserve that biodiversity. And by investing in transforming the wood in Gabon, we get more value to the wood, and people take care more carefully of that forest, of that biodiversity, because they know that it is jobs, it is employment, it is revenue, but it's the home of those populations. So we create a more sustainable link between the funding, the population, and the development that we want to be sustainable by this way. So we are already investing a lot in developing countries for our own conservation. But at this stage of the science, of the data, we know that our own resource will not be enough.
there's been a lot of research on what drives protected area effectiveness, and the biggest driver is actually staff and capacity. So you need to have the people there. If we're gonna protect 30% of the earth, that's gonna be the single biggest land use on the earth. And we're gonna have to do a major investment in managing that land and capacity building. So things like guardian programs on indigenous lands, it's fundamental to financing. It's fundamental that we finance them if we're going to be successful. So the science and the financing have an incredible linkage right here.
Thank you. Go ahead, Jennifer. I also have a follow-up question from a virtual participant, but go ahead first, Jennifer.
And also speaking of financing, the science actually is already there about Indigenous peoples being effective guardians of nature. For example, the IPBES assessment itself says that although biodiversity, nature is declining all over the place, everywhere in the world, in Indigenous peoples' territories, it's declining at a much slower rate. So can we imagine what can happen if we empower Indigenous peoples more to be able to protect their lands? Because what's happening now is, although Indigenous peoples have these life plans that ensure sustainable development, there's lots of external pressure to admit industries that destroy biodiversity. Now, if we strengthen the Indigenous peoples, they will be able to be better guardians. Can you imagine how much better they can be? And this, for this reason, in the climate change negotiations, there was announced an IPLC pledge, $1.7 billion, to ensure forest tenure and land tenure. And that's because there are also scientific studies showing that if the tenure of Indigenous peoples is secure, then they will be able to protect their territories better. And that's the reason why we're also saying that there has to be direct access for Indigenous peoples, dedicated funds for Indigenous peoples, so that we enhance what's already been found by scientists so far.
Thank you very much, everyone. I just have a follow-up question from Chloe from Climate Home News, and then we'll take another question from the floor. So just asking if you can talk a little bit about, where is it in terms of the discussions this week at these meetings? What do you expect to see come out of the financing, and what are developed countries proposing as well? Brian, do you want to start?
Sure, the finance issue first came up at the last negotiating session in Geneva. It was the first time that there was any real discussion about it. I think that we saw at that point that there was a large gap between what was currently being pledged and how much was needed, as well as a very divergent view of what else is needed in terms of is there a need for a new funding mechanism? So a lot of issues left unresolved that will be discussed again this week. Both the level of finance, how much money is needed overall to close the biodiversity finance gap, how much of that will come from subsidy reform, how much of that will come from official development assistance, how much of that will come from domestic budgets, and where that money can and should flow. Who will have access to that? Will Indigenous peoples and local communities have direct access? Will only governments? All of that is on the table for discussion this week. And Stephen, who's a negotiator unlike me, can speak much more clearly about what he thinks this week might bring in terms of finance.
Yeah, thank you. I think in this session we'll have two main targets dealing with finance, target 18 and target 19, that will deal with the harmful subsidies we have to tackle, and also the global goal in terms of financing biodiversity. And at this stage, we still have tough discussion because there is a package in terms of finance, a full list of solutions, and I think none of the solutions will by itself resolve the whole problem. We need to consider the different solutions. It has been reminded here. We need definitely public financing in terms of ODA that will strengthen the capacity to countries to really manage that biodiversity, to set up policies and identify action plans. But we also need to address the bigger financing opportunities that our private sectors, and this is why the GBF is really important, because it's not only saying that we're going to have goals and target and monitor it, but we're going to have a common global understanding of what we should do to protect the biodiversity, not only for government or local communities, but also for private sector, for consumer. And by having an ambitious global framework, we'll develop the standards that all of us will apply, and in terms of financing, in terms of private sectors, everyone will have to do his homework to develop tools and mechanisms to make it possible. And this is why it's really important that we address all of those issues, but also we address it in a manner that can be very clear for the other non-party stakeholders that will play a key role in the implementation of this framework. So the financial system will have to shift its paradigm to integrate biodiversity as an asset, as also an important and major issue of the world. And I was saying to some colleagues that the day we will have Moody's giving a notation to countries, including biodiversity aspect, we'll see how fast countries will adapt their system to have a AAA note by Moody's. But as that's not cost any dollar, it will just term of including this in the financial system. And that will raise and be catalytic to raise a lot of money to develop a sustainable and biodiversity world for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll stay on the topic of financing. David will read out a question we received.
Exactly. Gloria Dickey of Reuters is online, and she sent the question. She says, we saw, oops, my phone, hang on a sec. We saw the WTO come to an agreement on harmful fisheries subsidies last week. So the question is this encouraging for addressing other subsidies in the CBD process, or does this show that the WTO could be a better arena to address these? Thanks.
Brian?
I think it was encouraging to see that. Any move to reform subsidies and to reduce the pressure on nature that subsidies are driving, and we see this primarily in fishing as well as in fossil fuels and agriculture, are three kind of main sectors where we're seeing subsidies that are driving the loss of nature. So it's a welcome issue. The CBD is a unique instrument in that it covers life on Earth and maintaining the use and the conservation and the benefit sharing of biological diversity. So it has such a broad scope. So obviously it's going to bleed into other areas, whether that be climate, the economy, and others. And all these things have to act in concert. The CBD alone can't solve the biodiversity crisis. We need the climate convention to be a success. We need the WTO to work on subsidy reform. So the CBD needs to set these targets globally. Not all of them will be implemented just within the CBD framework. Some of them will be done in the climate framework. Some will be done in national policies, and some will be done in the WTO. But it's important that a global forum that comes together for nature, which is what the CBD does, that they set that bold vision that then can be followed through at the WTO and other venues.
Thank you, Brian. Any other panelists want to weigh in? Okay. I see a question from the floor at the back.
My name is Peter, from the Guardian. And just following up on the issue of financing, we saw in Geneva I think South African countries were a bit hesitant to get fully on board on the 30 by 30 because, again, for lack of commitment on financing. What will happen if the negotiations again this time will not yield a clear path as to how financing of this ambitious project would be? Where would that leave the discussions, knowing that COP15 is cast in stone? How do we move from there?
This Brian or Stephen?
Yes, I think it's very important that we bear in mind that this 30 by 30 goal, it has been recalled. It's the minimum we can do. But we also need to recognize that in those negotiations we come here with several traumas. We had Copenhagen. That was a trauma for a lot of climate negotiation, as I am, and we have Aichi. So country needs confidence. I think we need to rebuild the trust between partners, between countries, between developed and developing countries. We found that we will still have countries saying that, and the African countries that wasn't in board with the 30 by 30, it wasn't that because 30 by 30 is not an appropriate goal. It's to say that to effectively manage those kind of protected areas, we need capacity, we need resources, we need people, we need technology, and we found that we cannot just come and commit because we have to commit and go back home without any certitude, any confidence that we will implement what we are saying. And this is I think the big part of the job here, to make the link between what the science is saying, what the country feels that they are capable to do, and what are the opportunities to close the gaps in terms of finance, in terms of science, in terms of capacity. So this is the main challenge we are facing. Some of those countries are now a little bit more open to join that target and to join that goal of 30% of protected areas. But definitely we need to link it with the concrete implementation mechanism that will follow up this target.
Thank you. I know Dr. Woodley wants to weigh in, and maybe Brian?
The World Business Council does a global analysis of threats to civilization, and right at the top, the last 2 years have been biodiversity loss and climate change. So where before we had a real division between people who wanted to save nature and the business community, there isn't one now. And I think everybody understands that we have to solve the financial question at this meeting to move forward on the other. The other point I want to make is there's 21 targets here, there may be 22, and they're all important. And target 3, which maintains at 30%, is for us highly important. But if we cannot solve, we're not going to solve the nature problem with only implementing target 3. We need to implement 21 targets in a combined way.
Thank you. Go ahead, Brian.
I would add to that finance issue that you raised is also relevant. It's not limited to 30 by 30. In fact, 30 by 30 is one of the places where we've seen actually some major increases in finance. Protecting Our Planet coalition of foundations came together to pledge $5 billion towards it. Last week, or this week, the G7 made a statement about that included 30 by 30 as well as pledges for increased finance. We need more concrete numbers from the G7 as they meet next week, so that's going to be important that what they put as aspirational there becomes more specific in these negotiations. But I want to say that finance is an issue for all of the targets, and so it's I think that's a critical component we want to reiterate, is that finance needs to increase so that we can see all of these targets achieved, just as Stephen said there. They all work in an interrelated way: restoration, conservation, sustainable use, benefit sharing, recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples, pollution, invasive species. All of these things need to be addressed. All of these things take resources, and we're calling for governments and the private sector to increase their financial support for biodiversity.
Go ahead, Jennifer.
And as if things were not complicated enough, I would like to bring another one into the mix. It's not just the targets actually where finance is important, but there's also a separate discussion ongoing on digital sequence information, which is an attempt to advance on the third objective of the convention. The third objective, which is access and benefit sharing, has always been viewed as also a financial mechanism. So those who have done a good job protecting their biodiversity should be able to benefit from that. And one thing that could help, I think, with financing is to finalize this global multilateral system that would ensure that benefits arising from the uses of GSI or genetic resources are shared.
Great, thank you. Do we have any final questions from the floor? Yes, we do.
Hi, my name is Li Wei from Malaysia. I have a question for Jennifer regarding on the challenge of addressing Indigenous people on their role in protecting the nature. So as we know that some of the countries, not many of their people are aware of their roles, and how to make sure these Indigenous people are coming forward to address their issue and to spread the awareness to the other people on their role. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. Well, the first step is to put Indigenous peoples in the overarching policy, which at this point is going to be the post-2020 framework, And in target 3, which is the area-based conservation target, in order for people to know that indigenous peoples actually exist, it's important to expand on this word equity to adopt the language that was proposed in Geneva and that remains unbracketed in the current Geneva text. It's fully upholding and respecting the rights of indigenous peoples. So if we exist in the target, it's easier, it cascades down. The next is section B bis, which is sort of guidance for implementation of the different targets. And there's currently language there around exactly how do we go about respecting the rights of indigenous peoples. And that cascades from there, because once we have those targets in place, then the CBD Traditional Knowledge Division will have the mandate to popularize or to build capacity on indigenous peoples' issues among indigenous peoples, but also among governments. But I think also if we can write more broadly, since we are journalists here, about the situation that indigenous peoples are facing, these kinds of things can be solved by a firm commitment through the targets and through financing and through implementation moving forward. Thank you.
We'll take 2 more questions from the floor, I believe. 3.
Imelda from the Philippines and from the Earth Tourism Network. Actually, it's just a follow-up from her question, because we know that there are many countries that don't have legislation recognizing IP rights, right? So how can we ensure safeguards for them much? Thank you.
As you know, the Philippines is an exception, but of course implementation is still a challenge. But this is what we are hoping for, because the CBD is regarded as sort of soft law in the international level. And the language is also soft. It's indigenous peoples and local communities. A country may claim not to have indigenous peoples, but they will always have local communities that are embodying traditional lifestyles relevant for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. And I'm quoting Article 8J of the Convention. So even in cases where a government does not have protection for indigenous peoples in place, they are still obligated under the convention to respect the rights of local communities who embody traditional lifestyles, as I said. But of course, the best way forward is for countries to actually adopt legislation that recognizes and protects indigenous peoples as such. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you very much. My name is Ibrahim. I'm art journalism and film. I'm an investigative journalist based in Dhaka, Bangladesh. So my question is that my country focuses a lot on climate change, sea level rise, etc. issues, but very little focus on biodiversity and threat of species like wild Bengal tiger. So people think Bangladesh has a big threat from the climate change, but don't understand it's linked to biodiversity. So what is your thought about that, and how can we change current thinking of our people? Thank you.
Well, first of all, Bangladesh's biodiversity is incredible, and it is already shown that there's a huge connection between climate change and biodiversity. No place more than mangroves, for example, as an example of doing storm protection, that both as well as absorption of carbon, and then the benefits for people because they provide incredible habitat for fisheries and others. So Bangladesh is not alone in prioritizing climate above biodiversity. I think almost every country on the planet does that currently, and I think that's a challenge because biodiversity, as we've heard from the scientists, is every bit as important as the climate. These are systems that need to work in concert to sustain all of life on Earth. And so I think this is a challenge for people around the world to communicate to their government leaders, to speak to the media, to share that biodiversity is not just a nice to have, it's fundamental to our food, the air we breathe, the water we drink, our systems. And if we don't start to treat biodiversity as the same level of global priority as climate, we're destined to lose it and pay a much bigger price later. So I think this is a challenge for the CBD as an institution to become more vocal, for the political leaders around the world to pay attention to this and to become better versed on the science, and for people to listen to indigenous people in local communities who have shown a pathway of how biodiversity can be central to a way of life. but others may have other thoughts on that.
I think it's starting. No? I agree with everything Brian has said, but it's starting because for the very first time in the Glasgow Climate COP, there was a recognition of the link between nature and climate change, between biodiversity and climate change. But also here, Stefan and I are going back to conference room 3. We're going to be taking up target 8 that recognizes also the linkage between biodiversity and climate change mitigation and adaptation. And that it contains something along the lines of biodiversity protection can contribute to mitigation and adaptation as long as it's done in a way that doesn't compromise biodiversity. But we would like to add also it doesn't compromise the rights of indigenous peoples and biocultural diversity because there's a recognized link, clear link between biodiversity and cultural diversity. So we hope that that helps if we have that target now. And just also from the perspective of someone who works on the ground, in my community, whenever we have solutions, we have solutions to the problems that community is facing, we don't say, oh, this is something that's for biodiversity protection, this is something for climate change mitigation. It's all the same thing when you go down to the community level. So these links really have to be more clearly communicated. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Stefan?
Yeah, just to draw on what Jennifer just said and what we can feel globally, it's not a problem only in Bangladesh. Almost everywhere we face that situation. But it's also the complexity of biodiversity. It's as complex as it is beautiful because we have so many things to handle and to manage at the same time. When we talk about biodiversity, we almost talk about all the life on Earth. And when you talk about climate, it's very easy. You just count carbon. And even a kid can say, okay, if a ton of carbon is this, okay, I can understand. So it's complex, but this is the challenge also where we need your role and you as journalists or influencers to make people really be connected to the biodiversity. And in some cities, in some areas, even in developing countries, we start to have a mode of life where we just feel that we deserve all that biodiversity provides to us. We doesn't deserve anything. We have to recognize that this is biodiversity. This is why we have life on Earth, and try to understand as much as we can all those connections are important with our life, with the development, with the quality of our health, and etc. So climate change is on spot because it's really easy. It's really easy to manage even if we still have few challenges, but I've been in climate negotiation and I was like, okay, I will join my team in Gabon in biodiversity and they will learn from us, but I'm learning a lot and I'm starting to understand it is much more complicated than dealing with climate change.
Thank you, Stefan. Okay.
One last question.
So there's somebody that was waiting behind you as well. I think we'll start there. And then we will take 3 more questions from the room, but we only have 10 minutes left, so I would ask you all to limit it to 1 question, please.
Okay, aloha, thank you very much. My question is, how are we going to make sure the ocean remains a top priority in the 30 by 30 and as is implemented? I am Solomon Kaho'ohalahala, and I'm a native Hawaiian representing KUA, an NGO from Hawaii. And we have indigenous experiences in very protected areas, and I would be happy to answer and share some of our experiences, but that's my question. Thank you.
Jennifer?
Yes. Well, one thing that's easily overlooked is that in Target 3, 30 by 30 is actually covering both land and sea. I think there needs to be more, more publicity or ways of highlighting exactly how the sea is an important part of this target. And this is something that we're also thinking about in the Indigenous Caucus, about highlighting, how Indigenous peoples regard the ocean as kin, how we are guardians of the ocean, because it's the examples so far in the IPBES are mostly on terrestrial guardianship of Indigenous peoples. But if you look very closely at sea-based Indigenous peoples, there are also very, very important lessons to be learned there. In New Zealand, for example, the rights of the river there that it was recognized as a being that has rights, and we're hoping that the same would be recognized for the oceans, because in genealogy of indigenous peoples, you can very clearly see that the ocean is king. So yeah. Mr. Woodley?
So certainly IUCN and others are pushing for this land, sea, and inland waters language targets like Target 3. So we have all those major biomes covered. The interesting thing, and this will not come as any surprise to you as a user of traditional knowledge, is that traditional knowledge and science really strongly agree that if we protect 30% of the ocean in no-take areas, we're going to catch more fish for people, and that is something, a message that we need to get out. Conservation works in whole earth systems or whole ocean systems for us all.
Thank you. I have one more question from the floor.
So thank you. I'll ask that question as I just walk up to keep my recorder here. So yeah, my question directly to Jennifer, Indigenous Peoples dedicated fund and direct access to finance is an issue that has been dragging along for years across all the UN conventions, including the CBD convention. What's the main problem here? Is it the lack of will, the perceived perception of lack of capacity, or is it indeed the lack of capacity? Thank you.
I would say it's all of the above. First, there has to be a will, no? And the good news is that recently, many of the funds have started putting in place dedicated funds for indigenous peoples. So the World Bank has done it through the dedicated grant mechanism. The GCF, Global Climate Fund, is also thinking about doing something similar. And now the Global Environment Facility has put in place an inclusive conservation initiative. It's small amounts, but it's a start. But one of the things that we've observed is that accessing the funds is so difficult. So we said, sure, capacity building will help for indigenous peoples, but do we really want to take away indigenous peoples from what they are good at? Do we want to make them bookkeepers? You know, do we want them do we want to make them accountants? Whereas they could be more effective actually being in the community and protecting the territory. So these are the questions that have been raised. We're conducting studies to look at exactly where the barriers are, but it's broadly along these lines, the will as well as the capacity. So capacity building will help. However, we believe that there needs to be some adjustments also in the requirements of financial institutions so that we meet each other halfway. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I have a final question from Chloe Farron from Climate Home News, and I think I will close us nicely today. What does progress look like on finance or other areas by the end of this week? And what would you like to see happen before delegations leave Nairobi? So I'll take everyone in turn. We can start right next to me, Dr. Woodley.
Well, if we're going to be successful, we got to go to the COP, which is now going to be in December in Montreal, with a really quite well cooked global biodiversity framework. We can't have a lot of square brackets because it's too difficult at the COP to deal with that. And we have to have resolution on the two issues which have been mentioned here, financing issue and the digital sequencing information. I think because those are probably too complex to be dealt with at COP. So that's what I think success looks like.
Great, thank you. Stefan?
Thank you. I think for us the success will be to really resolve what can be done at the technical level. Clearly point out what needs the political level to go to the COP and be able to say, okay, this is what we saw, and this is exactly the last point you have as political to find solution or make this take decision, and then we can hope that we adopt the GBF at the COP and the GBF which is ambitious as we want. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Probably the same answer, but the solution of digital sequencing information that recognizes that indigenous peoples and local communities should be the main beneficiaries, as well as including indigenous peoples as part of the governance of the fund. And of course, Target 19 without any brackets, hopefully, but also including language on direct access and dedicated funds for Indigenous peoples and local communities. Thank you.
I agree with what's been said earlier. I would say, not just in specifics, but one of the things I think would be a sign of success is a change in the approach that negotiators have. Less about focusing on the narrow regional or very country-specific interests only, and starting to approach the negotiations that we all share a planet, that we all have a global stake in solving this biodiversity crisis for all life on Earth and for future generations. And that change in approach has to happen if we get from a very defensive almost approach to a collaborative one that is solution focused. And I'm hoping that transition happens here in Nairobi. And then on finance specifically, next week, not necessarily here, but the G7 will be meeting, and they are some of the largest donor nations. They need to start to move from rhetoric that they are supportive of increased finance to putting concrete numbers forward. So I think that is a positive sign of momentum that we can see going into the COP.
Thank you very much. I hope you will join me in thanking our panelists for this very informative, passionate, enlightening talk today. We will be sharing the recording of the press briefing for those who are interested. If we don't have your contact details, please come up to me or one of my colleagues. We're happy to add you to our distribution list as well. So thank you again, everyone, for taking the time today. I know you're busy with negotiations.